And we are live. Yes. Bienvenidos. Welcome, everybody, to Age of Revolution's first webinar. It's co-sponsored by the University of North Carolina Press, Latin American and Latino Studies program, at Smith College. A very big thanks to these organizations, of course, to our participants who will meet here shortly. And of course, thank you to the audience for tuning in. My name is Cindy Ermus. I'm a professor of history at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I'm also co-executive editor for Age of Revolutions, along with my co-host, Bryan Banks. Bryan?
Hi, everybody. My name is Bryan Banks. I am a co-founder, co-executive editor of Age of Revolutions. I'm also an assistant professor of history at Columbus State University. I'll turn it back over to you, Cindy.
Thanks. Today, we are so pleased to discuss Dr. Miguel La Serna's recent book on the MRTA, that is the Movimiento Revolucionario Tupac Amaru. It is titled With Masses and Arms, Peru's Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement. It was published just this year, congratulations, by UNC Press. Now, before we begin our introductions, I do ask the audience, I see everybody's ahead of the game here. We're all well-trained, someone said a few minutes ago. But I do ask that you please mute your microphones if you haven't already while you're not speaking. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, as it were, using the Zoom function. And we'll try to call you in the order in which you raised your hand during the Q&A. Also, please note that while the talk will be primarily in English, we do absolutely welcome questions in Spanish during the Q&A. I'll repeat that briefly. La presentación será en inglés, pero les invitamos, claro, preguntas en español durante las preguntas y respuestas al final. Si quisiera hacer alguna pregunta, por favor, haga clic en levantar la mano en el Raise Your Hand de Zoom y intentaremos llamarle en el orden de participación. Ahora quisiera introducir nuestro autor. I'd like now to introduce our author, Miguel La Serna. He received his BA in History and Spanish from the University of California, Davis, and earned his PhD in History from the University of California, San Diego. Currently, he is Professor of Latin American History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and editor of the open access journal A Contracorriente. He is the author of numerous books and articles on Peru's internal armed conflict. He has received research and writing fellowships from ACLS, Ford, Fulbright, Guggenheim, National Humanities Center, and he is the recipient of the 2019 TUMI USA Excellence Award. And I'll turn it now over to my co-host.
Yeah, so after Miguel talks here in just a minute, we will receive or hear two comments from our two commentators. First will be Lucia Luna-Victoria, who is a first-gen PhD candidate at the University of California, Davis. She was born in Lima and recently returned in May, right? Grew up in South Florida. She received her BA from Swarthmore College in History and Latin American Studies, and her doctoral dissertation is titled Urban Battlegrounds, Survival in Lima During the Peruvian Civil War. Her research has been funded by a number of places, including the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at the University of California, San Diego, and James R. Scobie Award from the Conference on Latin American History. After Lucia's comments, Javier Puente will then comment too. He received his PhD from Georgetown University and currently serves as assistant professor of Latin American and Latino-Latina Studies at Smith College. He is the author of a number of articles on the agrarian history of Peru. His projects have received sponsorship and support from the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, the John Carter Brown Library, and the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, among others. Last but not least, Javier is a part of our editorial team at Age of Revolutions and an incredibly valuable member of our team, for certain. So I guess we'll turn it over to you now, Miguel.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I also want to thank the Age of Revolutions for organizing this event. I'm very humbled to be a part of it. Thank you for all who have attended virtually. And I'm just really thrilled to be here to talk about my latest work on Peru's MRTA. Y como había dicho antes, esta charla va a ser en inglés, pero también pueden hacer preguntas en castellano después si quieren. También estamos trabajando en la traducción del libro actualmente y esperemos que esto salga dentro de un año más o menos en el Perú. Y habrá otro simposio virtual en agosto, el 26 de agosto, con mi colega Ponciano del Pino, y también habrá oportunidad también de conversar sobre el libro en castellano en tal ocasión. Pero voy a seguir entonces en inglés por ahora. So, Mr. Serpa Cartolini awoke early on the morning of April 22nd, 1997. It had been 126 days since the rebel commander had led 13 of his comrades from the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement, or the MRTA, in storming the residence of the Japanese ambassador to Peru in an upscale Lima suburb. The rebels and their 72 hostages had been locked up in the residence with no electricity, no running water since before Christmas of the previous year. A former labor organizer, Nestor Serpa, was an ideological purist of sorts, and he believed that that armed struggle was really the only way to achieve meaningful systemic change and revolutionary change in Peru at the time in the mid-1990s. And when the voices of compromise emerged within the rebel organization, Serpa actually had been among the hardliners to stomp them out. By now, however, in 1997, most of his comrades in arms could be counted among the long list of the MRTA's deserted, defected, detained, and deceased. All that remained were his 13 subordinates inside the residence and a handful of guerrillas who were scattered throughout Peru and South America. Still, Serpa believed that he could use a show of military strength to actually get his way out of this situation and this predicament that he found himself in. And he wanted to use this hostage situation to negotiate a prisoner exchange where the hostages at the embassy would be released in exchange for the release of the MRTA comrades who were locked up inside throughout Peru's penitentiary system. So after calling his troops to order, Serpa announced that they, the Tupac Amaristas, would be singing the anthem to the heroes of Los Molinos. And we actually have one of the good things about these virtual conferences is that we can share some material. So what I'm going to be doing is sharing with you a recording from inside the Japanese ambassador's residence of their singing that anthem, El himno a los héroes de los molinos. And I'm going to try to share that with you right now to the extent that this is technically possible. So.
briefing understood.
So that was a recording that was taken from the scene, the National Intelligence Service, that was actually a bug that was put inside the residence to record some of the what was happening inside. And the voice that you heard commanding was the voice of Nestor Serpa. And that was the kind of a situation that Serpa himself found himself in on that day in April, as he sat inside the residence of the Japanese ambassador. And the hymn that he sang and that the other rebels sang was a tribute to the heroes who they've considered to be the heroes who had been ambushed in Los Molinos, which was in the mountains outside of Jauja, during a 1989 rural campaign. And Serpa and his comrades believed that the army had given these guerrillas no quarter, and they believed that the army had actually massacred many of them after they had surrendered. And the anthem was as much a tribute to these martyrs as it was an admonishment against surrender, particularly in the situation that they were in inside of the residency of the Japanese ambassador. And it was also a key component of the MRTA's kind of political cultural war, in which the Tupac Amaristas sought to situate key moments within their own insurrectionary experience within the kind of arc of Peruvian history. And so and so this was kind of the situation that Serpa was in this late April morning. And witnesses say that that day Serpa appeared rather melancholy. They said that he had mood swings that had become more and more frequent, and that he had spent large stints holed up in bed, actually, toward the end of this standoff with the government of Alberto Fujimori. And it's hard to tell what happened and why he may have been feeling this way. Perhaps it was because of the broken down negotiations with the government, or the 4 months of captivity in this very kind of stuffy residence in bad conditions there, or perhaps it was the grim prospects of a peaceful revolution. But according to the witnesses who viewed him that day and spoke with him, they felt like it seemed that some of these things were weighing heavily on him. But still, Serpa refused to give in. As he had said on multiple occasions, actually, and repeated even that morning, he would not stop until the government released his comrades from prison. There was no room for compromise in his view. Either he was walking out of that residence a free man, or he and everybody else in there would actually not leave the residence. And so the fate of the revolution that he was trying to wage, as he knew it, really depended on how this hostage crisis played out. So the MRTA ranks among the more formidable Latin American insurgencies of the Cold War. But while there has been kind of a rise in scholarship on other Latin American armed leftist organizations in recent years, most studies of the Peruvian internal armed conflict focus on Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path. And with the notable exception of the excellent study by my colleague Mario Miguel Mesa, who actually is really pioneering the work to look at the MRTA in its own right. But most of the scholarship is really exclusively on the Shining Path and on the Rondas Campesinas, the kind of peasant militias that fought against the insurgents. And so despite the kind of remarkable nuance and depth of analysis offered by scholarship on Sendero Luminoso, there are several key aspects of Peru's internal armed conflict that have kind of still managed to somehow escape our scholarly attention. And so I just want to focus on a couple of these areas that I think we need to still develop a little bit better to really understand the complexity of this period of armed violence in Peru. And the first is perhaps the most surprising one, is that we don't yet have a very well-developed history of the lived experience of war for those who fought it. Particularly those who were on the side of the insurgents, the MRTA, the Shining Path, but also by those who fought for the state counterinsurgency apparatus, members of the police and the military. we do have some good studies about the rondas campesinas done by pretty remarkable anthropological studies by Kimberly Tyden, Oren Starn, and others, Pepe Coronel. But we don't really have as much of a developed history of what daily life experience was like for the combatants who really who fought on either side of this insurgency. And so while most studies do touch on specific massacres, individuals, and communities, they don't tell us they tell us a lot less about just what it was like to be a kind of a foot soldier or a kind of mid-level or even kind of some of the higher ranking people who were fighting these wars with their kind of boots on the ground for those who participated both in the insurgent violence or the counterinsurgency. But we're starting to see a shift in the historiography and recent works by scholars like by historians like Ponciano del Pino. He has a work that's underway that's going to try to really highlight this. Renzo Aroni's study as well are going to kind of offer new insights into this kind of scholarship, but we still have a ways to go, I think. And a second underexplored topic of analysis within this historiography of the political violence in Peru is really the role of women and gender inside the guerrilla organizations. So some of the best scholarship on women in the conflict, once again, focused on peasants, indigenous women and how they experienced it, both as civilians, but also as members of the Rondas Campesinas militias. But really only recently have scholars started to make use of newly available sources like prison interviews and newly available archival records to start to reconstruct what the insurrectionary lives of for example, Shining Path women leaders and some of their kind of regular rank and file followers have been. And here I'm thinking of studies by Tony Zapata and the new anthology by Anouk Kine, for example, which are starting to really explore what this was like. But I think we still have much to learn about the lived experiences of rank and file and even kind of mid-level women within both the Shining Path and the MRTA, as well as the gendered conduct of insurgent men and the intersections between gender, culture, and power within Peru's kind of radical armed left. And the third aspect of the historiography that I think merits more attention, which I'd like to discuss, is really kind of any well-developed historiography of Peru's other major guerrilla group, the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, the MRTA. And again, like I note here that Mario Miguel Mesa's study is actually really pioneering study to situate the history of the MRTA within the broader history of the Peruvian left. But for the most part, though, when the MRTA is mentioned in other studies, it's kind of in passing or with like an acknowledgement, yeah, there's this other group, but that this is beyond the scope of this study. And so we don't really yet have a kind of well-developed historiography of the MRTA in Peru, despite it being, again, a major force in its own right. And despite the fact that had Sendero not been part of the picture, probably everybody who studied the Peruvian conflict would be really focusing on the MRTA because they had a very similar impact to groups in other countries at the time. And so this kind of exclusive media and scholarly attention on Shining Path has really produced a narrative of Peru's internal armed conflict that is, in my view, still incomplete and still in some ways misleading or inaccurate, because the MRTA has gotten sort of lumped together with studies of the Shining Path when really, as Mario Miguel Mesa notes, they really couldn't be any more different in many ways. So Carlos Iván de Gregori, who of course was the leading scholar of Sendero before he passed, he really set the tone of the what has been called Senderology, the study of Sendero, by highlighting, I think, three defining features of the Shining Path. One is its cult of death. The second is its abolition of the ego, and the third is its exaltation of its leader, Abimael Guzman, who was known as Presidente Gonzalo. And so a lot of mainstream media coverage and some scholarly representations of the Shining Path have focused on this sort of popular image of the Shining Path. And you know, we could all, many of us who study Peru can remember, you know, images taken by media of women inmates in the Peruvian prisons, maximum security prison, who kind of staged demonstrations and theater, sort of revolutionary theater, to Presidente Gonzalo. And these images kind of contribute to this popular representation of all Peruvian rebels as being sort of a revolutionary enigma. So if the Che Guevaras and the Carlos Fonsecas and the Raúl Sendics of the world were kind of romantic rebels fighting against imperialism, against capitalism, against authoritarianism, the Andean rebels have always appeared as these sort of these kind of dogmatic cult-like maniacs at the fringes of the global left. And so one of the things that I'm attempting to do with this book, but that looks exclusively at the history of the MRTA, is to kind of respond to each of these areas of historiographical oversight, while also challenging this myth of the Andean conflict and of the Peruvian rebels specifically. So as this book shows, far from being kind of quasi-religious fanatics of the popular imagination, many middle and working class Peruvians took up arms precisely because they questioned conventional wisdom, precisely because they challenged authority. So for most, this desire, this kind of propensity for recalcitrance only strengthened once they joined the rebel ranks. And I would argue that it was actually, there's some new evidence to suggest that this was the case even with Sendero, that they weren't just so kind of following orders all the time as we had believed. So this exploration of Tupac Amaristas' women and men's experiences allows us kind of a way out of what Cynthia Milton has appropriately called the salvation human rights kind of binary that she so astutely notes for how post-conflict narratives have been shaping up. And in doing so, it kind of builds on recent autobiographical accounts by people like Lucio Gavilan, former child senderista and now noted anthropologist, and Jose Carlos Agüero, also a noted philosopher and writer whose parents were in Sendero as well. And they describe kind of life inside the Shining Path with I think with refreshing intimacy. But we still have much to learn about the quotidian lived experiences of combatants on both sides of the conflict. And so this book, With Masses in Arms, it seeks to offer new insights into these experiences by really exploring the daily challenges and decisions and conflicts and insecurities and struggles of the Tupac Amarista rebels, and also of the counterinsurgency forces who pledged to stop them. So With Masses in Arms is really mostly, first and foremost, a narrative history. And so rather than offer a kind of blow by blow of this 13-year-long conflict, the narrative really follows a cast of a diverse cast of characters whose lives the war kind of brought together in sometimes very unexpected ways. So it focuses primarily on rebel leaders and foot soldiers who bet their lives against the status quo and sometimes paid the ultimate price for it. And these insurgent stories are complemented by those of members of the Peruvian government and by Peruvian security forces, from heads of counterterrorism police down to the civil guard kind of watchmen who were often neglected jungle stations. And so along the way, the readers also will meet some ordinary civilians whose lives the war also swept into its orbit. So it's a history of the war more so than a history just of the MRTA itself. But among the people whose insurrectionary lives the book follows are two women who achieve different levels of status within the MRTA. The first, Lucero Cumpa, is well known within Peru as being kind of one of the heads of the organization, and certainly one of the faces of the rebel organization. But Cumpa started off as a low-level militant, actually, in the mid-1980s, and she ended up working her way up to the Central Committee and eventually would command the guerrillas' guerrilla front in San Martin. And so, but despite occupying one of the most coveted positions within the rebel hierarchy, and despite being among really the only women to command any guerrilla army during the Peruvian armed conflict, Cumpa has actually not been the subject of much scholarly analysis, although she has appeared in different forms, but not in a real kind of systematic way. And so this book offers a rare portrait of a woman who rose through the ranks of the rebel command structure, showing not only that women were present in the left's guerrilla campaigns, but they actually helped shape and help lead them. But it's not just a story of women's agency. After all, Lucero Cumpa was the exception, not the rule. And the story of the book's second woman protagonist, who I'm calling Esperanza Tapia, which is a pseudonym, is, I think, far more representative of the experience of Tupac Amarista women inside the rebel organization. Yet for both the foot soldier Tapia and the commander Cumpa, they both experienced gender and power in similar ways, despite their differing rank. So while the MRTA publicly advocated women's empowerment and gender equality, and in some ways was discursively progressive for its time in this area, women at all ranks of the MRTA experienced an insurrectionary culture of paternalism, patriarchy, and misogyny, really every single day of their lives while they were in arms. And so whether it was limiting women's access to guns or propping them up as these sort of rebel poster children at times, or restricting their physical movement or blurring the boundaries between reality and role play, rebel men often sought to exert physical and symbolic control over women's bodies inside the movement. And so as common as these attempts to kind of control and contain women were, so too were women's efforts to contest and challenge and really cut through these transgressions. And so these kind of, as the insurrectionary lives of Lucero Cumpa, Esperanza Tapia, and so many other women demonstrate, women actually rebels waged their own internal revolution by really refusing to let the slightest kind of transgression go unchecked, no double standard go unchallenged. And really only through these daily struggles against micro and macroaggressions did these Peruvian women actually manage to change the guerrilla patriarchy from within. And for these women, the daily battles for dignity and equality and respect mirrored what historian Michelle Chase, channeling Fidel Castro, has called the revolution within the revolution. But the MRTA was very strategic in how it presented women combatants to the public, even when that contradicted with its actual use of how women's actual roles within it. And this is because the group understood that, you know, in a late 20th century context of the Cold War, that its ability to win the sympathy of a skeptical public really depended on its capacity to win the public relations war. This is something that will become very much associated with later groups like the Zapatistas of Mexico, but and with earlier groups such as the July 26th movement in Cuba. But the Tupac Amaristas also, they understood that in this kind of late 20th century context, the ink and cameras and photographs and videos and radio were weapons that could be just as powerful as guns and cannons and tanks. And the MRTA frequently privileged political theater over theaters of war, putting to test the theory that the lens was mightier than the sword. And so whenever possible, the Tupac Amaristas attempted to kind of persuade or cajole or even deceive the free press into covering their actions in the most favorable light, always with a mind for the optics. And the MRTA wasn't alone in this kind of molding of war and theater. And as anthropologist Shane Green notes, the Shining Path too captured the popular imagination through this kind of aestheticized politics. And so, but for all their efforts, both the Shining Path and the MRTA failed to win the hearts and minds of the majority of Peruvians, much less the armed struggle. So what explains these limitations? Well, there's a number of factors that contributed to the MRTA's ultimate downfall, and they're explored in the book. But one that I highlight in particular, and that was, I think, kind of one of the most restricting things for them, was their own limited version of what Peru was and what it could be. And so for all the group's fixation on the past and on this sort of narrow definition of nationalism, the agendas and priorities of the MRTA's militarized, more hardline faction, it constantly prevailed over those of probably the majority of their comrades who are actually more open to articulating an inclusive, progressive vision of the future that responded better to late 20th century Peruvian and Latin American realities. And so, as the book shows, time and again, when presented with opportunities to actually move toward a more inclusive, more social democratic, more peaceful and more forward-thinking agenda and platform, the MRTA's more nationalist, more authoritarian, more bellicose, and more backward-looking voices always tended to prevail. And this unwillingness by a few hardliners to compromise, to converse, and to concede led the movement into a position that was at once politically untenable and militarily unwinnable. And this is a position that Nestor Serpa found himself in on the afternoon of April 22nd, 1997, as he sat alone inside the Japanese ambassador's residence. And the book, With Masters in Arms, is the story of how he got there. Thank you.
And now we will have our first comment from Lucia Luna-Victoria.
Well, thank you, to Age of Revolutions and Javier and Bryan and Cindy for the invitation. And I want to thank Miguel for contributing this much needed book and narrative on the MRTA to the historiography, as he's just told us. So what I want to do is I want to kind of highlight a few concepts and ideas that stood out to me, and then throw in some questions. So one of the most interesting aspects of the work is its accessibility. I think Miguel has chosen to fill this gap in the Peruvian armed conflict, telling us about the MRTA through a narrative history. And I think for first-time readers of Peruvian history, they are introduced to figures like Victor Polay or Lucero Cumpa, protagonists that they didn't always get a voice in that kind of history. And we also see voices from MRTA lower ranks, which expose kind of the contradictions of the movement and the convictions of the movement. So I want to ask Miguel, and you touched on it a little bit in your intro, what factors weighed in that decision to use a narrative history? And how did you decide which voices to use, or were there voices that you had planned to include and didn't make it to the final manuscript or the final draft? That's kind of the first comment. I have another kind of idea that is, and you talked about nationalism. You advanced the MRTA's use of nationalism, especially in the 4th chapter, The Capture of the Flag, where you trace kind of this San Martin's flag and its whereabouts, and the meaning of that flag for Polay's political war. And the book makes clear that the MRTA positioned itself as Peruvian as you can be, in stark contrast to the kind of the foreign shining path and Maoism. And later they defend this position, right, as a nationalist, this nationalist position when they're associated with international revolutionary movements and this larger kind of communist Cold War threat. So given this narrative of a nationalist guerrilla, I was kind of asking myself, how was the MRTA viewed by revolutionary movements abroad? We know that other movements provided some help, like Sandinistas, I believe you mentioned. But what was the extent of this kind of ideological support, or if there was significant financial support for the MRTA, especially once they changed kind of leadership, once Polay gets captured and so forth? That's kind of a brief question on nationalism. Another kind of the third concept that I think is very valuable is there's a critical narrative of the MRTA in the book, and I think there's several narratives that kind of reveal the flaws of the MRTA's kind of democratic revolution. And one of them that caught my attention, I think it's chapter 11 mostly, is Juan and Tigre, kind of their stories in Oxapampa. And they kind of talk about the failure of the MRTA to understand indigenous ways of life and customs. And this is not unique to the MRTA, right? We know that the Shining Path also didn't, well, they're more like disregarded local customs, economic traditions, and so forth. So for the MRTA, this comes up when they go to San Martin, Oxapampa, and it is revealing how they are initially able to have some support from people, especially those who participated in the Mir and other revolutionary periods, but they lose that support once they get too violent, or as the narrative told us, like once it becomes evident that the indigenous population are regarded as second-class citizens and devoid of kind of full membership of the revolutionary movement. Now, the book emphasizes that it was kind of that shift of power between the democratic wing and the radical wing of the movement that characterized or was responsible for this behavior that was contradictory to that resolution on multiculturalism that the MRTA passed. And my question is, how much, if, you know, for Miguel or for others, is how much of this explanation of the shift in power from the wings should we take at face value, or how much of the MRTA was somehow a pretense of a democratic revolution, and how much of the MRTA was actually revolutionary? I think this is curious because, you know, Miguel, when you weave Lucero Cumpa's narrative, we see that MRTA is media manipulation, and you talked about this in the intro, you know, especially her outing to the media, dressing her up in the olive green uniform when she never really wore the olive green uniform, that theatricality, you know, despite, and you tell us, like, despite the perceived gender equality, women were fighting an internal revolution. So for, you know, thinking about that was a pretense for the media, for the national context, it was a political war after all. But the contradictions in the field that we see from Juan and Tigre in the Amazon, that is a pretense its own members were supposed to be buying, they were believing. And from their testimonies and the narratives that we've seen, many saw the opposite was happening. So I think, yeah, it'll be good to know how revolutionary the MRTA really was. And you provide another example of this by incorporating Roger Pinchi Vasquez's testimony on homophobia on behalf of the MRTA, and, you know, the resulting torture, rape, and assassination of his brother. And I think the book kind of situates the LGBT kind of experiences during the armed conflict, and you call it kind of a symptom of Cold War hypermasculinity. Now, I think that you've kind of opened a space for this narrative of LGBT experiences during the conflict, and hopefully more studies on resistance, survival, and advocacy can come out of it in these communities, because I mean, it's something that there is barely anything, if any. So I think, yeah, what the book has been able to do is open up this spaces, right? And you say that, you know, the work is not done, there's still more to come out of it. So I think, yeah, your book kind of has broken the ice in a manner of speaking for more research, perhaps on MRTA and Shining Path interactions. I was also wondering about, like, MRTA members that trained in the armed forces, such as the story of Daniel, and even further studies on the legacy of the MRTA in Oxapampa or San Martin, especially Tarapoto. You know, was there a conclusion to the armed revolution in these regions? And what did it look like? Because we see that the embassy kind of take over as finality in some regard, but how was it in the other regions? So to conclude, I just want to emphasize, you know, Miguel's contribution with Masters in Arms is one of the first narrative histories of the MRTA. It is unique, you know, it's a unique approach to this long, complicated period. And it leaves several avenues open for further studies and questions regarding the role of the MRTA and the extent of their revolution and the extent of their impact on 20th century Peru, and the left in Latin America in general. And it's a role that up to this moment is still contested, and as you know, Miguel has told us, it's kind of been overshadowed perhaps by historiography of the Shining Path. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and the way, thank you, Lucia, for those insightful comments. The way we've envisioned this is Javier Puente will now add his comment, and then we'll give Miguel some space to reflect on those comments, and then we will open it up to the audience. So, Javier.
Thank you, Bryan. First and foremost, I would like to thank Miguel for giving us this fantastic opportunity of having a conversation about this incredible book, and also to Lucia for joining me and sharing some ideas and questions with all of the audience today. I guess the first thing I want to say is that like Miguel and Lucia, I'm also Peruvian, and hence I read Miguel's book, as I read all of his previous works, with a deep sense of emotional intimacy. The story he recounts here affected us on many levels. They shape our livelihoods, they shape our childhoods, our youth, frame our lives, and in the case of us three here, so Miguel, Lucia, and myself, and many of you in the audience as well, also our professional academic decisions. And so when I was reading the early praise for the book, I noticed that some scholars, some of our colleagues point out that this book fills a gap. I would like to advance some praise by saying that Miguel's book does much more than just filling a gap. It completes the canvas of a generation. We have now a brilliant piece of scholarship that scholars, Peruvians, and anyone interested in the history of our country have been needing and almost craving for quite a while. So one of the book's foremost achievements to me is placing the MRTA not only within the Peruvian context, but also within the Latin American genealogy of revolution. Due to the historical and historiographical emphasis on Sendero Luminoso that Miguel mentioned during his presentation, and due to this Maoist inspiration that Sendero had, Peru's guerrilla experiences seem to be limited to the miserable failure of the MIR in 1965, or the enigmatic and fairly exotic rise of Senderistas in 1980. A careful and detailed study of the MRTA, its origins, discourse, and operations, like this book is, ultimately fully insert Peru into the Cold War dynamics that link Colombia's ELN, Nicaragua's Sandinistas, Uruguay's Tupamaros, and those sense of other guerrilla groups that shape the political landscape of the region through the second half of the 20th century. As Miguel notices it on his book, the political and revolutionary importance of the MRTA is eclipsed by the bulk and heft of Sendero. So unveiling this story and making it accessible for an international audience is truly commendable. As I was opening the book, I thought about the number of ways in which Miguel could have addressed the challenge of writing a fairly subterraneous history of the MRTA. I envisioned newspapers, CVR testimonials, police reports, and other forms of institutional sources. To my surprise and delight, Miguel does use all of this combined with other forms of ethnographic information, including declassified and rarely accessed documents of the Vincote, memoirs, and interviews with former Embarretistas. This vast and diverse array of sources gives, with Masses of Arms, a powerful and quite alluring human dimension that gives both a vivid and demystified portrait of this guerrilla group. In this very refined account, it should come as no surprise to see the active participation of women and their own multidimensional struggles internally and externally within the group as militants and without as guerrillas. I think scholars should appreciate that the first comprehensive published monograph on the MRTA has such a central gender dimension in its analysis. Any future scholar who attempts to write a similar book should also benefit from paying attention to the structure and the writing style. Having gathered a truly remarkable number of kinds of resources, there were an infinite number of ways in which this narrative could have taken a fairly traditional and, to be honest, quite boring route. And instead, I think Miguel delivers really a memory book that fully empower those testimonials, their voices, and the stories that shape his analysis. A sequence of 22 brief chapters should be read as a succession of human vignettes, sensibly tied together with concise and precise analytical interventions. The result to me is having this book as a very sui generis form of historical writing, synchronic and diachronic at once. Very difficult to put down once you start it. It is analytically compelling, it is theoretically robust, and yet it remains human at its core. Historians and other social scientists sometimes seem to forget that we ultimately deal with human experiences. Miguel and this book have reminded us about this unique aspect of our disciplines. In the spirit of propelling forward a webinar conversation, I want to share something beyond this well-deserved praise, most in the form of questions and curiosities. The first one has to do with the adamant presence of Sendero Luminoso throughout many pages. In fact, early in the book, around page 3, the prose seemed to be so focused on Sendero Luminoso that I almost thought that I had grabbed the corner of the living by mistake. It is clear to me, and as it is many to you in the audience, that the MRTA had a secondary role in the internal armed conflict in Peru. However, I feel that Miguel almost felt like he wanted to suggest something deeper, some sort of dialectical relationship between Sendero and the MRTA as interpreters of Peruvian history. So deeply intertwined, both of them, that you cannot fully understand one without the other. So that's the first question. The second reflection has to do with the class identity of the MRTA and perhaps the sort of like enduring question about the class identity of revolution, not just in Peru, but also in Latin America. Unlike other revolutionary experiences in Peru, including Senderos, and elsewhere in Latin America, Polay, Cumpa, Serpa, Galvez, among others, seem to have a working class origin of some sort. The very identity of the MRTA is strongly linked with ferreterias, fábricas, and other rounds of labor. The party's martyrdom celebrates those working class origins. As Miguel claims himself, while Senderos' revolution seemed to remain against Peruvian history, the MRTA's guerrilla politics adamantly try to insert themselves within Peruvian history. Yet the group never quite gets a grasp of Peruvian society, and its symbolic struggle seems to keep them at odds with a country engulfed in a wider state of conflict, economic depression, and political meltdown. How do you see or understand this tension? And I guess the question that I wanted to ask is why Peru couldn't have a truthful, encompassing, and far-reaching revolutionary experience? So to keep this short and sweet and just open the floor for further conversation, once again, let me congratulate you, Miguel, publicly for this major achievement. I think this truly consolidates your role as one of the leading voices of our field, and it's a privilege and a pleasure to continue learning from you and your scholarship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. And now we'll turn it over to Miguel for his response.
Thank you, first of all, so much to Lucia and Javier for those really insightful comments and questions and thought-provoking inquiries that you had. I have been given a lot of thought to some of these questions by others. You are kind of posing to me for the first time, so I will look forward to kind of really teasing them out with you, actually, and others who are here in the audience. But yeah, I'll just start with Lucia's comments, which kind of overlaps with something that you said, Javier, which was kind of like about the decision to kind of write in this style with a narrative history. Why did I do this, and why, and you know, how did I make decisions in terms of whose voices to focus on? And I do think that that a lot of this was really based on, as Javier, as you mentioned, this drive to really, this strong desire that I have as a historian, and many of us probably who are here in attendance, actually, to kind of to really put, you know, the human element of the humanities into our work, and to show that human story in all of its complexity. So this book doesn't try to apologize or criticize, as I say in the book, but it does try to humanize, and that means telling the story sort of really in all of its complex human dimensions. And so by doing that, I felt that that narrative history was the best way to do this. I'll say it again, but Manuel Miguel Mesa has a really excellent kind of insurrectional history of the Shining Path in his PhD dissertation. And so I wanted to complement that and build on that, as opposed to kind of reproducing what I already thought was an excellent really first kind of take at a political history. And so I thought that the narrative history, by focusing on the experiences of some people at different kind of ranks within the MRTA, would help tell the story and really show that these were human actors who were flawed individuals, as all of us are, but that they were really they actually were trying to make their country and the world a better place. This goes as much for the MRTA as for the counterinsurgency forces, who sometimes both of these groups kind of tend to get typecast as these sort of ruthless monsters. And this is not to take away from any of the actual atrocities that were committed by either side, but it certainly is to show the motivations and the anxieties and the daily struggles that people on both sides of the conflict face. And I thought that really trying to give an opportunity for some of the historical actors to tell their own story was a way to do that. There were voices that I would have liked to include that didn't have access to. A big one is Peter Cárdenas, who he was living in Sweden at the time, and I was never able to really get his perspective, although I was able to get some of his testimonies and other things that he has kind of contributed to the historical record. But that's a voice that I would have liked to have. But instead, I was really grateful to the family and associates of Victor Polay Campos, because he's on lockdown in the naval prison in Peru and is really on a complete isolation. He was not able to do an interview, but he gave very graciously gave me access, as did some of his associates, to others around him who can kind of produce different testimonies, stories and vignettes, but also actual writings that he had produced himself. So that was really something that I benefited tremendously from, was the sources that I had. And then others was, like I would have an episode that I didn't really know about, and somebody who I'd be interviewing would say, "Oh, you need to talk to so-and-so." I mean, that's kind of the very traditional snowballing kind of not very probably methodologically sound strategy, but that definitely did help by talking to folks who were able to put me in contact with others who had a kind of more firsthand experience of things on the ground. But I definitely always thought that I wanted to have a mix of voices and not just focus on the leadership, but to focus on people who we have heard of, like Victor Polay and Lucero Cumpa, but also on others whose stories would not have been told otherwise, because they don't have the ability in Peru, even to this day, to tell their own story in writing. And so that was kind of how I tried to do that. Your other question about nationalism and how the MRTA fit within kind of the other and was viewed by other Latin American revolutionary movements abroad, or even in Europe. And I did find that that there was a strong connection between the MRTA and other insurgent movements throughout Latin America. It was so much stronger than I believed it would be. And this was because I myself was also kind of looking at the kind of, Senderologo way of looking at things. And I kind of was using a lot of my assumptions about Shining Path and Sendero, which also had an international presence, I should say. But certainly Sendero went out of its way to avoid really any collaboration with non-Maoist Communist Party groups. And so, but the MRTA, because I assumed that there would be that sort of narrow definition of internationalism by the MRTA, particularly because they had such a nationalist kind of ideology. But to my surprise, I found that they collaborated with and corresponded with movements and actors from really around the world. There were cases of Migristas from Chile who were collaborating with MRTA and in Peru, actually training and abetting some of the efforts of the MRTA. There was what was called the Batallón América, sort of the Americas battalion that was made of guerrilla groups from different Andean countries to form a sort of international coalition. And so this is not to mention, as I think you mentioned, that there, the connection with the Sandinistas and some Central American groups. So this connection is actually something that has really intrigued me. And I just kind of started to collect evidence on this as I was doing this research. And it's something that I would really like to explore further, because I think that the connection, the international collaboration and correspondence and networks, the transnational ones are actually a theme that's really wide open for exploration, and we're just starting to see this happen in other countries, like, for example, the recent book on Cuba's international kind of world. And I think that this is something that is a theme that's worth exploring in the Peruvian case as well. I appreciate what you said about the sort of how revolutionary was the MRTA and the sort of contradictions with respect to the MRTA's treatment of women in cases, indigenous peoples and others, and LGBTQ members of the LGBTQ community, which were downright violent and really atrocious. And so, how do I explain that? It's something that I think is probably not unique to the MRTA, but it's something that we find in many other organizations at the time, particularly of the armed left. So I don't think it's really, in that sense, that the MRTA was, more out of touch than other groups. But when compared to Sendero Luminoso, it is striking how truly progressive Sendero was at really bringing women's voices at all levels of the insurgency. And I think that that Sendero Luminoso was really in some ways ahead of its time for any armed organization in the 1980s, much less one in Peru. And so the contrast is really striking at how Sendero actually, as many here today know, they elevated women at all ranks, including in the permanent committee of the organization. 2/3 of the permanent committee were women. The only man was Guzman, who of course notably had a lot more kind of power, but or at least symbolic power, I should say. But all the way down to the rank and file, and many of the kind of guerrilla columns that would go into different villages were led by women, in fact. And so that was very attractive for a lot of young women, particularly in the Andes and other places, who felt like this was an opportunity to be empowered when they didn't really have a lot of opportunity to do so within the structures of their own communities. MRTA was more, in my view, more limited in its ability to recognize the contributions that indigenous peoples, that women, and that members of the LGBTQ community could actually offer to helping the MRTA reach its goals, because it had a very, I think, truly revolutionary agenda that it put forward in the late 1980s with this kind of this new platform, a revolutionary platform that specifically talked about issues of gender, specifically talked about multiculturalism, and many other things. And that was a really revolutionary document that the MRTA produced. But in practice, it didn't really pan out that way. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that there was a power vacuum in the late 1980s with many of the original founders and leaders of the MRTA behind bars. And so that left a situation where kind of power was sort of decentralized in some ways. And so you had kind of people in areas like San Martin and Oxapampa and elsewhere who were pretty much calling the shots, and then they're bringing their own kind of assumptions and their own prejudices to this insurgency, even when it was in direct conflict with some of the more revolutionary platform items that were being put forward. And so for Javier, I really just want to thank you for those comments. That was incredibly humbling to hear that. I feel like you got from this exactly what I was trying to get out of it. And I do recognize that this is kind of, as you said, as the first kind of published narrative history of MRTA. It's kind of our first crack at it. And I do hope that future scholars will take us into new directions and into new heights, because I think there's a lot to still mine with respect to the history of MRTA. And you're right about the presence of Sendero. It's like unshakable. And so even as I'm discussing how like Sendero kind of sucks all the air out of the room, and Sendero is something that occupies all of our kind of scholarly conversations, myself included. Even as I'm doing this, I'm putting a lot of emphasis on Sendero. This is something that in Mesa's dissertation, he suggests that you can't understand MRTA with in a disassociated way from Sendero, because in some ways MRTA is a response to Sendero Luminoso. It starts to kind of emerge a couple years, 2 years after Sendero has launched its insurgency, And then it really develops into an actual armed struggle in 1984. So we're 4 years into the Sendero conflict. And so because of this, Sendero is constantly on the minds of even the MRTA leaders themselves. And they're constantly thinking, how can we distinguish ourselves from the shining path? And one way that they initially tried to do this was by kind of waging this more symbolic war and waging a more nationalist-minded war as well. And that's kind of how they constantly are trying to, one of the reasons why they want to dominate the media cycle is to get that message out. We're not Sendero. We're different than Sendero. We're more attuned to the kind of other Latin American leftist armed insurgencies that we've seen in the Cold War. And so the shadow of Sendero not only looms large over Peruvian historiography and really of Latin American historiography as being the sort of the other case against which to judge or to kind of analyze studies of the left, but also it's a shadowy figure over the MRTA itself, and it's one that I don't think the MRTA ever fully manages to shake effectively. But why couldn't Peru have a true far-reaching revolutionary experience is a question that I haven't been able to give a good answer to so far. So I won't pretend to have an answer for you now. In fact, I think there might be people in this audience who can give a better take on that. But my initial kind of response is that precisely because the MRTA emerges after Sendero is already kind of controlling the narrative of what the insurrectionary struggle is going to look like in Peru, it becomes difficult for the MRTA to really to distinguish itself as something different and something that's a viable alternative that people can really latch on to. Whereas had they emerged maybe before Sendero, we might have seen it may have become the far-reaching revolutionary experience that you're suggesting. But that's my initial take, and I reserve the right to recant that if I hear a better answer from anybody here today. But thank you very much for your comments and your questions.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Thank you, of course, Javier and Lucia. We'd now like to open it up for questions. Very briefly, I actually don't see a function for taking questions in order. I don't see a raise your hand option here. So I retract that I said in the beginning. Instead, please use the comments, the chat board, I should say, to pose any questions or to raise your hand, so to speak, that way. And yeah, we can take it from there very briefly. No veo una función aquí para poder tomar preguntas en orden, o sea, como pensaba, así que si pueden poner sus preguntas en el chat y las tomaremos por ahí. Gracias. ¿Algunas preguntas? ¿Alguien quisiera comenzar? Anybody would like to pose a question? Adrián? Yes, you can unmute if you prefer to pose it that way. That's no problem at all.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question, hi everybody, and thank you, Miguel, for what looks like a fascinating book and to the organizers. My question is about the geographical diversity of this movement and reach. And I know the book seems to be focused on the experience of the Merretistas essentially rather than its overall impact. But how does this geographical diversity impact the experience of the Merretistas? And I'm, because of my own biases, particularly interested in the Amazonian component of this insurgency and of this revolutionary experience. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to say it's nice to meet you virtually, by the way. So thank you for that comment. Yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing is that really complicates the story from Sendero. Of course, as we know, Sendero kind of has been identified as more being part of the South Central Andes, whereas the MRTA emerges as an urban insurgency. And it actually is operating in Lima and in other major cities, Huancayo, and other places in the early years. And so it develops as a kind of urban insurgency, and in that sense more closely resembles maybe the rebels that others have studied in Uruguay or Argentina, and that's how kind of it starts. But eventually there is a strong impulse to establish a rural foco, you know, in a Guevarista sense, in the jungle. And so there's an initial attempt to actually corner that sort of, that kind of market in Cusco. And one of the very first kind of efforts to establish a foco is actually not in the jungles of San Martin, but in Cusco. And this happens early in 1984. And it fails miserably. This is Luis Varese, the sociologist, was actually put in charge of establishing the foco in Cusco. That fails miserably. The plot is discovered pretty quickly, and after that, Luis Varese ends up really not being a central leader of the MRTA anymore, and it seems like he is blamed for that failure, which leads to the arrest of most of the kind of guerrillas who are trying to start an insurgency there. So the initial plan was Cusco, precisely because of its symbolic and historical role in Peru's insurrectionary history. And then when that fails, the MRTA really kind of retreats back to Lima and to the other cities, focuses on more urban campaigns, the kind of Robin Hood acts that they were known for early on. Kentucky Fried Chicken, blowing up or burning down Kentucky Fried Chicken food chains, and doing the repartos, the kind of food distribution trucks. And they really focus on on really establishing a foothold in the city as an alternative to Sendero, which is seen as more of a kind of Maoist countryside operation. Even though we now know that of course that Sendero was operational in Lima really from the outset. But then there's a lot of discussion and debate about where to establish this foco, and it's decided that San Martin, the jungles, like as you said, of the kind of the Amazon region, becomes that place. And they ended up doing this in late 1986 and starting a group there, which Polay himself and Serpa at various moments help actually lead. And so San Martin becomes, in Tarapoto and surrounding areas, but particularly Huanhui, become areas that the MRTA is able to really capture fairly easily, and they really are able to establish a presence. And it's not until the government establishes a kind of counterinsurgency operation there that the MRTA kind of starts to cede ground. But the idea was San Martin, which was the noroeste, the front, the north western front, eastern, is the kind of is going to be the place where they set as their base of operations. And the MRTA maintains a foothold in that part of the jungle for the rest of the insurgency. They don't really cede ground until fairly late in the game, into the mid-90s. But that becomes the sort of rural counterpoint to the more kind of robust urban operation that they're doing from there on out. Thanks.
Thank you. Stephen, let's see, I should read it. Stephen Gruber would like to pose the question on class identity and the MRTA that Javier posed, and relate that to the dynamics of MRTA, not with Sendero, but with the legal left, La Izquierda Unida, basically in their politics.
Excellent question. Yeah. So as Javier mentioned, many of the sort of the leadership of the MRTA, particularly of the sort of like I guess local kind of level, like within Lima, the different columns that were operated, they were operated by working class folks like Fernando Valladares, for example, was a working class young man. Lucero Cumpa also came from Comas and grew up in a working class background. You mentioned the kind of the history of the others as well. And so, yeah, I do think that working class experience did help shape who they became and some of the efforts that they did. That's why they quickly tried to establish a presence in some of the barriadas, the pueblo jóvenes, the kind of, what's the word? The like, I guess shanty towns or something, but that those parts of Lima, and many of the people who would end up being kind of militants were from these backgrounds, and they were people who were students, and they actually kind of were very active in the legal left kind of politics really before they joined the MRTA, and they continued to maintain that connection even as the war was underway. So unlike Sendero, which is kind of the party or nothing, the party was the end all be all, and you had to organize only through that party. The MRTA had a lot more connections with the legal left, with Izquierda Unida. There were jokes among some hostages from the embassy crisis that people like Javier Canseco was like buddy with Mr. Sherpa even while he was being held hostage, and they kind of it appeared clear to these observers who were obviously biased that they had some sort of already affinity for one another as it was. But there definitely was, the MRTA was open to the more kind of the kind of all forms of struggle, kind of Leninist model, where the insurgency, the armed insurgency was just one element, but they had a kind of really developed political apparatus and connections with the legal left as well. So they didn't say just because we're doing the insurgency, there's not that other part. But the unfortunate thing for the MRTA in terms of its own kind of demise, in my view, is that when the kind of people who served as the connection with the legal left and with the kind of more democratizing forces in Peru, when they tried to kind of persuade the party apparatus to kind of lean more heavily into that, there was always a more militarized wing that believed that they should never actually cede any ground militarily and never really compromise in that sense. So there was always a legal left connection, but it never really prevailed in terms of the ultimate agenda and outcome.
Thank you, Miguel. Any questions? Francisca? Francisca would like to ask, she says she has not had the chance to read the book yet, but she was wondering what sort of resources were used to construct the narrative, and how was the process of working with them once you did trace them?
Thank you for that question, Francisca. So it was, as I think Javier hinted at, I tried to kind of pull from a range of sources, as opposed to letting kind of like one type of source really dictate the narrative. And so in addition to doing interviews and kind of visits with some former members of the MRTA, I pulled in sources from La Vincote, the kind of Peruvian counterterrorism police that I was able to get access to, that were really insightful and important to offering new perspectives, particularly in terms of what intelligence looked like. The audio that you heard from inside the embassy was also taken from a source within the scene, the kind of intelligence apparatus. So I was able to get some sources from the state that were really useful, as well as the wonderful archive of the Peruvian Truth Commission, which is housed in La Defensoría del Pueblo in downtown Lima. And these included actually oral testimonies, transcripts. There were some propaganda that are still housed there to this day. And so that was able to give me a lot of kind of perspective from the MRTA itself for people who I wasn't able to actually locate or who are no longer with us to this day. But there's a collection, certainly, of periodical sources, sources from the Peruvian Truth Commission, Vincote, and kind of also the mega juicio, that the super trial that was conducted of MRTA members many years after the fact, where they were retried on terrorism charges, and I was able to get access to those sources as well. So between those, it kind of allowed me to try to reconstruct these stories when otherwise the sources would have been a lot more limited. Excellent question. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Eric Selvin will take the next question. And Eric, you're free to unmute if you prefer, or you can type it up.
Thank you. If
perfect.
You can all hear me just fine. This has been fabulous, and your work is great, and not just this book, but the other stuff I've read over the years is very impressive. And the recent book with Oren Starn on love in the Andes about Sendero is quite fascinating. My quick comment is, it's very interesting. I was thinking about in the late 80s, I was in Nicaragua and spending a lot of time there and interviewing a lot of people. And I was asking about other revolutionary groups and other connections and stuff. And it was very striking that, two things. One, the Sandinistas, to the extent that there was a group you could call the Sandinistas, the different groups, they certainly saw themselves as they were the pros and they had won and they knew what they were doing and everybody should be listening to them. And so I got to hear a lot in particular about, these dumb Salvadorans who wouldn't listen to them. But they had a very clear sense that MRTA was its own thing, right? It was not, I don't think they confused it with Sendero, but I think they were unsure what to do with both of them. Right, that there were two of them, and that they seemed at odds with each other, I think they found confusing, and it made them unsure what to do. And so I guess that's what leads to the question I have for you, which is to what extent were there connections? To what extent was there overlap? How much were they talking to each other? I've talked to some people in Peru, I've talked to some people in Nicaragua who make it sound like there were connections, but they're hard to trace out if they're there, at least for me. So I'll stop and listen. Thank you all very much. Also, the commentators were great as well. Thank you.
I agree. And it's nice to meet you as well. It's good to meet these people who I've been, in intellectual conversation with, actually, in actual conversation. So so the question then is about the connection with the FSLN and the MRTA, not with Sendero and the MRTA, correct?
That's right.
Okay. As you said, it's very difficult to trace those connections. I know that there were more likely individuals who would end up becoming founding members of the MRTA who had spent time in Nicaragua in the revolutionary period there, and who then kind of returned to Peru. And so they had that sort of a connection. In fact, Luis Perez, who I mentioned earlier, was one of them. And so, but in terms of sponsorship, for example, or funding, I have not uncovered any kind of paper trail there. What I have is very anecdotal, and it's more on a sort of level of individuals saying that they did go to, Nicaragua they would go there to say, for example, to rendezvous to discuss the merging, say, of the MIR with the MRTA in the mid 80s. And so it was kind of as is typical, as you know, people would go to this kind of safe haven so they can feel like they can actually have a place where they can carry out these revolutionary conversations. And I have found some evidence of individuals who were planning on traveling, say, to Nicaragua, but then were arrested before they actually made it there. And so it's very episodic and it's very anecdotal. But it's definitely a theme that I would like to explore more. So I don't have a good answer in terms of like a smoking gun connection there, as much as I do that there does seem to be some overlap and folks who spent time in Nicaragua both before and during the insurgency.
Perfect. Cecilia Gallagher has a question, if I may. I think Miguel said that Sendero empowered women by giving them ranks of power within their system. I can't reconcile this with their machista mentality, and I'm wondering if those leading roles could have been more out of convenience or as a scapegoat strategy.
Yeah, and that's an excellent question, and one that I really grappled with myself. I think that, so yes, that is true, and I agree with the fact that, so if we're having a personality cult like Sendero, and the leader is like a leader máximo, right? Like he's it. He is kind of the all-powerful being. Then does it really matter if you're number two? it's like, who cares about Mike Pence when Trump is president, sucks all the oxygen out of the room, and all praise goes to him. So I understand that real concern. And of course others like Camarada Feliciano, his actual name escapes me for a second, what's his name? Ramiro Duran. He has actually kind of criticized publicly Guzman for having what was sort of a kind of revolutionary harem, where he surrounded himself with these women who could, the suggestion there is clear, but also others have suggested that they were there to kind of like really look after the dear leader, to take care of his medical needs, which were many, make sure he was, eating properly, things like that. And so that was more almost like they were kind of refined to sort of secretarial kind of duties. I don't actually think it is that cut and dry in my own kind of research, and I think that that while I understand that criticism, I think the narrative does kind of tend to take away from the real power, influence, and kind of role that women did play within the race of Sendero Luminoso. And my other book that I wrote with Oren Starn, we argued that actually that there are two other women in the permanent committee, Elena Paraguirre and Augusto La Torre. They actually, in many cases, were calling the shots, and in many cases, they made decisions in committee. And the two of them felt very comfortable objecting to anything Guzman suggested within that sort of committee, but publicly they were always united. And changing the agenda. And I think that one of the reasons why so many women had such prominent roles from the Central Committee all the way down to the rank and file was because these two women and others, many of them who are in the central leadership, really did push forward an agenda that recognized women's empowerment and the role that they would play. Of course, it's fit within a Maoist kind of ideology of women being, the greatest thing under heaven, or whatever the phrase attributed to Mao is, but certainly they believed that without elevating women to an equal stature to men, they were never true socialism. And so I think that I would just like, while I agree with that criticism and that there is that internal contradiction, my personal take, and this goes with what Jamie Heilman and Tony Zapata and others have said, is that it's actually they actually did have a tremendous amount of influence in Shining Path's really trajectory, platform, and propaganda.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have a question for you, Miguel. I'm an early modernist that works in the French Atlantic, and so a lot of this has been—
Nobody's perfect.
That's right. I have to remind myself that every day. Thank you. And so this has been fascinating, right? I rarely work in the 20th century, but one of the bread and butter courses I teach is The Age of Revolutions, right? The title of the website and so on. And the way I organize that is we go American Revolution, French Revolution, Haitian Revolution, Latin American Revolution, and then each one of those is split into 3 units, kind of origins, the revolution itself, and then what's often called in cultural history as the afterlives or the reverberations of something. And so when I conclude my Latin American revolutions class, I always try to tie in later social political movements that are appropriating the language, the kind of historical figures of the revolutions that preceded them. And right here in the title of your group, the MRTA, is Tupac Amaru. I'm wondering what kind of multivalent meanings are attached to that icon in this movement. In what ways does that figure become a kind of contested ground for competing political agendas within the movement, maybe? That's my question. Yeah.
That's a great question. The answer to your question is the book that I initially set out to write. And then it took took on a mind of its own. But my initial interest in the MRTA was in exactly what you're discussing, this kind of discursive, like, tug of war, where really, and quite appropriately, where Tupac Amaru is the kind of the object of that is being struggled over. just as in the image that many Peruvians know of him being ripped apart when he's drawn and quartered, there's that sort of being reproduced on a national scale in the 20th century, where we have, the Velasco state, the military regime, reappropriates Tupac Amaru for its own purposes of propaganda, basically saying this top-down military state government is inheriting the legacy, the revolutionary legacy of Tupac Amaru from the late 18th century. And we are coming to embody and represent that, that sort of struggle, which we're completing. We're fulfilling it by having this big agrarian reform, by requiring Quechua in schools, and we're returning to that past. So that figure of Tupac Amaru is always present in many of these movements, both from the state level as well as from the sort of the perspective of the left. And then the MRTA comes in some ways tries to take that image back and reclaim it for El Pueblo. And so did, of course, the Miristas before them, right? So so you see the Miristas and then the state and then the Tupac Amaristas, and you see this constant kind of back and forth over who gets to reclaim the true legacy, the revolutionary legacy and the unfulfilled promises of Tupac Amaru. And so that was like my original idea to kind of explore that. And then I realized that, oh my gosh, there's just so much more to say just about the MRTA. Let's just start with that. But I think that it's definitely very powerful and very present. And they understood that in doing this, they were tying themselves symbolically to a kind of a revolutionary heritage and lineage of Peruvian history that harkened back to Tupac Amaru, that, as Lucia, as you mentioned, harkened back to San Martin, and that went back to even the Apristas, which had a little bit more of a kind of, a shaky relationship with the MRTA, but certainly that they saw themselves as aligning with this thread of Peruvian history that they were then moving forward into its next stage. And so Tupac Amaru was absolutely central to their identity as a movement and to what they're trying to say about where their revolution fits within the kind of pantheon of revolutionary figures in Peru.
Terrific. Ernesto Bassi is reminding us that the 18th century Tupac Amaru was also using the name of the original Tupac Amaru for political purposes, right? Yeah.
Excellent. That's a really good point. Yeah, so that goes even before that. And this says nothing about Tupac Shakur either.
Yeah. Are people dressing up in Peru like Tupac Amaru to protest the COVID-19 lockdowns? Like they're dressing up like George Washington in the States?
It'd be difficult to find that like pilgrim's hat, but I haven't seen it. But certainly, it's one of those things where some of you probably remember, was it like maybe 10 or 15, maybe 10 years ago, where they started making baby onesies with the MRTA flag, and then like it was a Peruvian flag with Tupac Amaru's face over it. And there's a huge backlash because people in Peru were like, that's the symbol of terrorism, and how could you do that? And I think whatever organization or company made those onesies didn't really quite realize it. They thought like, oh, this is a symbol of Peruvian nationalism. And then they didn't realize that in the kind of 21st century context, it has an association with what people believe is terrorism. And so that was kind of, you even see that figure and who gets to reclaim it really kind of being contested to this day.
Enrique Arias has a question, two questions actually, and thanks you very much for the presentation.
Michael Bunny has a question too. Michael Bunny.
I'm sorry. I actually skipped. So Michael, actually, why don't you go ahead and go first? I'm sorry about that.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
Enrique, we'll bring it back to you.
Yeah, sorry. Now I feel bad. So first of all, I want to echo what everyone said. I think the book is terrific. It is very difficult to put down. I read this thing in record speed, and I certainly recommend it. Anyone on this call who hasn't gotten it yet, go out and buy it, basically. And thanks a lot for writing it. One thing that I thought was really interesting that I had never heard before was that at one point you read about how Lucia Kumpa was actually in kind of traveling around Europe, so much so that she kind of lost sight of what was going on in Peru, to the point where she hadn't even heard of the Barrios Altos massacre or the La Cantuta massacre, which is really incredible given that those are two things that quite legitimately were used to discredit the Fujimori government. And I knew that the MRTA worked with, with the M19 and Alfaro Vive Carajo and forming the America Battalion and all that. But I was surprised to see that, and I was wondering, was the MRTA really invested that much in sending someone who would ultimately wind up being a really high-level guerrilla around Europe, and what were they trying to get out of that? Also, if I could kind of squeeze in, I hate to do this, but a second, somewhat related question, but in addition to trying to reach out to people around the country, I've noticed that in some MRTA documents, they sometimes refer to Sendero as being like popular or whatever, and they'll say, oh, we're a movement, they're a party, but they're a popular movement. But of course, it's almost like completely unrequited love, right? Sendero was always, any deviation whatsoever from Pensamiento Gonzalo, which is completely unacceptable as revisionism and all that. And I was wondering if you found any evidence of, did the MRTA really ever try to kind of cozy up to Sendero only to be immediately rejected, or were they always just more interested in differentiating themselves? So thank you.
Excellent. So thank you for that. So what happened was in the early 90s, the MRTA had staged a pretty remarkable prison escape, which to this day, some critics believe that was that the Garcia government had a hand in that, actually, as a sort of final really kind of gift to the rebels, because as it happens, the leader of the MRTA, Victor Polay Campos, and the president of Peru at the time, Alan Garcia, they were former college roommates, if you can believe it. And so there's a belief that maybe that was a kind of a final gift to them. But it does appear that that this was a major kind of escape where nobody was killed in this remarkable escape, where most of really all of the prisoners who were behind bars in Canto Grande prison managed to build a tunnel. Well, actually, a tunnel was built coming in, and then they escaped from it during the World Cup in 1990. And after that, it was kind of a shot in the arm for this movement, which was really actually struggling at that time with most of its leaders behind bars. And then this is when Lucero Cumpa manages to get onto the Central Committee and of the MRTA, and then she is actually captured again, and then she is rescued as with this really kind of like a really daring rescue operation. After that, everybody knows who Lucero Cumpa is, and she can't really go anywhere in Peru anymore, certainly not in Lima, without people recognizing her face. And this is part of the gendered politics that I discussed earlier, where her image was really used for propaganda to kind of paint a particular image of what a revolutionary woman looked like within the MRTA ranks. But after that, where she's such a high-profile kind of celebrity, the MRTA decides that she is too high of a risk to have her be in the country still, even though she wanted to go at the time to go fight in the rural foco in San Martin. And so they sent her abroad. They sent her to Europe on basically a sort of PR trip, where she is going to meet with different leftist organizations. She gives talks sometimes. She meets networks with other kind of solidarity groups, as well as other leftist organizations throughout Europe, Germany, France, different places. And her new role becomes to be the kind of PR spokeswoman for the MRTA abroad. And they believe that is the best way that they can kind of bring attention to their cause and to the struggle that they were currently in Peru, but also to kind of keep her away from the reach of Peruvian authorities. And she finally ends up making her way back to Peru, and that's when she ends up leading the rural command in San Martin. But that's what she was doing there. She was basically kind of trying to raise awareness about and get more sympathy and probably money, although I can't confirm that she was trying to raise funds as well, but for the cause. And then the other question was about, can you repeat the second one? I've gone on so long on this one.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just that the MRTA seemed to at least in some of their documents kind of attempt to suck up to Sendero, but of course Sendero didn't really return the favor, and whether or not whether the MRTA really got rebuffed or whether they never made that much of an attempt to cozy up to them.
Okay, yeah, excellent question too. So yeah, you're right. In the early years, some of their early documents, we're talking like 1984, 1985, they would discuss things that were happening specific to Sendero. For example, we're talking about 84, 85, 86, things that were happening to Sendero, like the massacre at the prisons after Garcia became president. And they would write about this in their propaganda with sympathy and kind of almost in solidarity with the victims and survivors of the prison, of El Fronton prison massacre. And so there were other things that were in the MRTA's early propaganda. They would actually, like you said, I don't know if they're sucking up is how maybe the right word, but I understand what you're saying about like they're trying to kind of situate themselves as kind of in some ways at least sympathetic to what Sendero was fighting for. But from the get-go, the MRTA was very critical of Sendero as a movement and as a group that was importing what they believed to be an external foreign kind of ideology onto sort of a national crisis and situation. And then they would most of the history of the MRTA and Sendero is one of bitter rivalry. Absolutely no love lost. Sendero believed that the MRTA was just like they were completely missing the revolution. They were completely out of touch. They were if anything, a minor nuisance. Sendero spent a lot of its, not a lot of it, but some of its 1988 National Congress dedicated to how to deal with the MRTA and what kind of threat the MRTA was actually posing. And so really, and they ended up in the prisons, the Senderista prisoners would call the MRTA los M-ratas, or the kind of MRTA. And so they believe that the M-rats. So they absolutely did not have any kind of sympathy for them. And from the get-go, the MRTA forms because it wants to be something that's different, in some ways better and more Peruvian, and in some ways more humanitarian than Sendero. But there were moments, as you pointed out, in their propaganda where they would align themselves at least kind of sympathetically with Sendero when different developments were happening within the internal armed struggle.
Thank you for the questions. So Enrique's questions are as follows. Do you have information about the relationship between the MRTA and Sendero prisoners, for example, in the Castro prison? The second question is whether the state had a differentiated response or strategy against MRTA in comparison to Sendero.
Okay. Yeah, so I kind of maybe jumped the gun a little bit with that last answer. They were in different cell blocks. So the MRTA prisoners were all in one pabellon, and then the other Sendero was in another, with the exception of the highest kind of ranking members like Polay and Osman Morote of Sendero. They were kind of isolated from the rest of their groups, but they I know so there really was no kind of really desire, particularly on the part of Sendero, to associate with anything outside of its own party apparatus. But I do think that there is some evidence of affinities that did, for interpersonal kind of relationships, friendships and affinities that did develop between inmates of Sendero and of the Shining Path while they were in prison. I'm not sure, I won't say who, just out of respect for their privacy, but I do know anecdotally of people who developed real meaningful, lasting friendships. But I don't know if those developed during the height of the war or if those kind of started to develop really once the fighting had started to die down. Oh, the second question, right? I always forget the second question.
So the first one, right, whether you have information about the relationship between the MRTA and Sendero prisoners, as in the Castro prison, and whether the state had a differentiated response or strategy against MRTA compared with the Sendero.
If there was a differentiated strategy, it's not something that I've really observed. I certainly have seen the same scorched earth policies, the same detention and disappearances, the same evidence of murder after people have surrendered and laid down arms for both Sendero and for the MRTA. But they did distinguish, high up officials did distinguish between them in terms of assessing the threat. And Lucia Petri, who was one of my interview subjects for the book, who was the former vice president and Navy admiral, who has been associated with the bombing actually of the Peruvian prisons and has always denied it. But he did say, even in his own book that he wrote, but he was one of the hostages at the embassy. He said that when he learned, right when the Tupac took over the embassy in late 1996, and he learned that they were the MRTA, he breathed a sigh of relief. I'm paraphrasing him, but he said he breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that because of the MRTA, like, we had a chance of surviving this, at least in the immediate kind of aftermath of this takeover, because he thought that Sendero was a lot more ruthless. And I've heard also some others who were Peruvian officials or just kind of rank and file police officers who have said similar things, that when they realized it's the MRTA, they calculated that their chances of survival were much higher than they were. And that's because, according to the Peruvian Truth Commission, the MRTA was responsible for less than 2% of all the deaths in the war, according to the Truth Commission, whereas Sendero was responsible for more than half. And so there's, or for the clear majority. And so this is something that they understood, that there was a different calculus, but they did carry out some of the very similar kind of counterterrorism tactics. But I think that this is probably one reason that led to the end of the story, which which I didn't really talk about, but all of the Serpa and all of his colleagues, comrades were all killed, and the hostages were rescued, and one ended up dying of complications after the rescue. But all the rest were killed, and some of them, it's believed, were killed after they had surrendered. But I think that it being an MRTA may very well have affected the calculus that Fujimori made and his government made in terms of how to deal with the situation. They probably were banking on the MRTA to not start killing people, which it did not do. It originally had over 400 hostages. That number went down by half within the first night, and then it eventually got down to 72. And nobody was killed by the MRTA. And so I do think that the kind of more shrewd elements of the Peruvian counterinsurgency apparatus did calculate that they had a better chance of carrying out this operation and planning it out without the MRTA actually kind of preemptively taking hostages' lives. And that is what ended up happening.
Great. We do have a few more minutes if there are any more questions.
Nope. That might also just be an ideal place to end. I imagine we're all getting Zoom fatigue on some level too. So we'll go ahead and close there. On behalf of Age of Revolutions, the University of North Carolina Press, and Smith College, the Latin American and Latino Studies program, I want to thank our participants, Miguel La Serna, for giving us an inlet to your amazing expertise on the subject, to Lucia Luna-Victoria and Javier Puente for your thoughtful questions, and to everybody else who joined us today for this really fascinating conversation. Hopefully we'll do something like this again in the near future. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.